Cool. So as a reminder to everyone, if you could please fill out the attendance form if you haven't already. And if you are watching this recording at home and you haven't yet, please also fill out the form on screen here. And as always, the link is on Slack along with the slides. So good morning, everyone. This is Software Saturday, lesson 4, more VueJS. So last week we began talking about VueJS and what it really was, and now we're going to go a little bit further with it and see how we can actually use it in a more not advanced, but in more proper use case fashion. So as a quick review, we're on week 4 of 7 here, so almost at the end. We have only 2 more learning sessions left this week and next week, and after that we will move to our project days. On our project days, we'll just kind of be in breakout rooms most of the time, talking about how to work on the project, getting some help, talking with other people, whatever it may be. So I highly recommend you guys do please come to them. It just makes sure that you can get on the right track and you know what you're doing for the project coming up. Let me move my chat over here so I can see it easier. Now, before we jump into too much, were there any questions from last week or week before that that you guys felt weren't answered properly that I can maybe answer for you guys now? That's all right. So as a reminder to everyone, I guess the kind of same as every week, we have weekly link sessions every Saturday. The recordings probably every Sunday. I think I'm pretty good about that. Review hours on every Thursday, and then Slack every single day. So can everyone, if you haven't already, please open your text editor. And as always, the files are on GitHub. The lesson 3 files have been pushed to the lesson 3 branch, with lesson 4 files currently being on the master branch. So part 1 is just a quick little review I want to do. So I think we've talked quite a bit about a lot of different things. So I want to ask you guys some questions, and if you guys could please put them in the chat or say them out loud or whatever you guys want to do. What do you think the answer is? So first things first, can someone tell me what HTML is? Not what it stands for, but what it actually is. Just put your answer in the chat, say it out loud. I want to get people thinking about it. AJ says it's a markup language used to create web pages. That is correct. Yes. So HTML actually stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's used to describe the layout and functionality of a web page. Cool. And second question here is, what is CSS? Anyone? Like, again, what is it? It stands for something else, but what do we use it for? Muhammad says, and Elijah and Evan, okay, thank you. It all says it defines styles, basically. Yeah, that's exactly correct. Now, one thing to remember here is, I don't think I should ask this question, but if you look at the review slide for lesson 1 here, HTML uses the idea of tags and nesting tags to represent different elements. Whereas CSS uses the idea of groupings of similar elements. Tags and groups do not have to be the same, but they can be. And if you recall, the 3 different kinds of CSS groups, one was a tag kind of group. And so you can actually be much more granular with your CSS and style a lot more specific parts of the site than you can with HTML. Oh, that was the wrong one. Sorry, didn't mean to do that really quick. Question number 2, what is JavaScript and how can it be useful? Well, I guess 3 at this point. Just put your answer in the text box. What is JavaScript and why is it so useful? It is a scripting language used for web page interactivity. Yes, that is exactly correct. It is a scripting language that's used literally everywhere on the web. And it's extremely useful, like you mentioned, because it allows pages to become more dynamic and extremely interactive. And you guys probably saw that a little bit between lesson 2 and lesson 3. And a big thing a big reason that JavaScript is so popular is also that there are a lot of functions and libraries like Vue that make the programming in JavaScript also incredibly simple and makes it really easy to do complicated things without much prior experience. All right, and then our last review is what is Vue.js? It's a bit trickier. If you had our call back to what we talked about a little bit, what it was, lesson 3. It's a JavaScript framework. Okay, that's a pretty good answer. What is like the what is one thing we talked about from Vue.js that can be used to modify HTML using JavaScript? It's like a 2-word answer. It involves the name of the framework and a command of sorts to give you a little hint there. What is the one defining feature, like one of the cool features of Vue that allows us to change HTML using only JavaScript? V directives. Thank you, Zachary. Yes. So in case you guys don't remember, V directives are kind of like the V dash and then some kind of keyword like bind, on, etc. And they allow us to directly modify HTML. There's a bit of another one out there for you guys. Can you name me the 4 kinds of V directives we talked about last week? There are 5 in total. We talked about 4 last week. What are their names? We have vbind, Elisha, thank you. Vbind, vif, vmodel, and von. Perfect, thank you. Everyone's kind of getting it. So again, just to recap, vbind is binding, like the name kind of suggests, an HTML property to the value of some JavaScript variable defined by Vue. Vif defines whether a HTML element will be seen by the user. Excuse me. Vmodel I think the word binds, but more like it synchronizes a variable to the status of an input text box. And von is used for event handling, typically clicks. Cool. So with that out of the way, it's time to jump into the first topic, I guess second topic for today, the final V directive. So like I mentioned, there are 5 main V directives. We only covered 4 of them last week. We'll talk about the 5th one right here. So it is V4. So what is V4? Well, V4 is kind of like a for loop, as the name suggests, and V4 can create multiple HTML elements based on the number of elements in a JavaScript array. And the cool thing about it again is it will dynamically resize the shown elements as the array changes. Now, at the very bottom is very useful with custom components. Don't worry about that too much. We'll talk about that in part 3 of today's lesson, and you'll see why we had that kind of requirement there. So the syntax for a V4 is very similar to like a Python for loop. So if you've ever taken Python before, you might be familiar with this kind of syntax. Like for some variable, I call mine item. You can call yours whatever you want. Item in array. Where array is, again, the name of some array. It doesn't have to be array. It could be list. It could be, I don't know, to-do list. It could be Pokemon list, whatever you want to call it. But the way you would do it is you'd say as kind of like the other V directives, you say v-4 equals, and then in quotes, item in array. Once you do that, you can then use item inside of your tag. So for example, this p tag here, I have it set up as, I use that regular text formatting you saw last week with the double brackets item. So what it'll do is it'll print out the value of item for every item that exists within the array. And this is why I say it's very similar to like a Python for loop, because again, that some kind of variable in some kind of array or list is exactly how Python does its for loops. So, however, unlike the last 4, V4 gets a little bit more complicated, which is why we talked about it this week and last week. So V4 should really only be used for a single element, meaning like a single P tag or an LI tag or like an image tag or something like that. If you need to make it use multiple elements or have it like nest elements, you're better off making a custom component and using V4 over that custom component. But like I mentioned, We'll talk about custom components more in part 3. Ah, sorry, I have some bad allergies today. We'll be talking more about that in part 3 of today's lesson, so don't worry about that too much. Just know that you should really only be v4 in a single element. The second thing is kind of like React, which we talked about a little bit last semester. Vue needs a key to determine what each element is. So this key can be anything, but it has to be unique for each element in the v4. So what this means is what happens and why we do this really is because when Vue is redrawing the list items in the web page, it'll look to try to match the keys of the new elements with the keys of the old elements. What it can then do is, okay, so these elements are the same, so only thing I have to do is make these changes, like remove one here, add one here, something like that. However, if you don't add keys or the keys aren't unique, which Vue will be very mad about, what happens is Vue has to remove every element and then re-add them all over again, which can take much longer if you say have 1,000 elements. And we want our pages to be quick and really snappy for the end user. So what Vue tries to do is minimize how many total changes it has to make. And using keys lets it figure out, okay, what data stays the same, what data changes, so that we only have to make the required changes. And like I said, it can be anything you want. It can be, like, for example, in this previous example, it could be the actual value of item. It could be some numeric number. It could be, I don't know, like the name of your something, whatever you want to call it. Not a problem. So then here's a little bit more of an in-depth V4 example. What key is treated like an HTML property. It's kind of like a faux property, meaning it doesn't really exist to HTML, but Vue considers it existing to itself. So it wants you to syntactically write it like you would any other, regular old property, but it will handle it and not HTML. So you use vbind like you did with any other kind of HTML-like property to bind the key to some value. And as a result, it's very common, very common to make the item an object of sorts. So for example, you can see here, my same old v4 item in array that we had in the previous example, but then I have this vbind. And this vbind binds the value of key to the value of item.id. And this implies that item is some kind of object with at least two fields, ID and text. And so we bind the key to some kind of ID. It could be, again, ID can be whatever we want. It's not super relevant to this. And next thing here is item.txt or text. And so again, we're just kind of doing the same thing we did above, but with a more proper Vue syntax now. So whenever you use v4, you should be using this format you guys see here and not the format we showed about earlier. Okay, and with that, let's just jump into demo program 1 really quick. All right, so these demos are, as always, on the GitHub. So look at demo 1. CSS is nothing fancy, some CSS there. Demo 1 HTML. So here's demo 1. The part I want you to look at here is this p tag and these two ul tags. So this ul tag. So if you guys recall back to lesson 1, ul is unordered list, meaning a bullet pointed list. And each bullet point has to be a separate li element or list item element. So what I do is I have a ul surrounding this and then a v4 over this li tag, meaning it will create multiple li's or list item tags depending upon how many items are in list. And this is kind of the same formatting from the lecture, but we have the key, which is item.id, and this element is item.text, where text is some kind of, some field in the item object. So if you look at our JavaScript code here, you guys can see right there that this view is pretty simple. You know, the EL, so we're mounting on the element, the ID of element, and then our data has this array list, which is the same list I referenced in the v4 over here. This list has 3 objects, ID 0, text, and ID 0, ID 1, and ID 2. My bad, I can't read properly today. The text, as you can see, is some kind of, just whatever text I have written down here. But the fun part of these IDs, as you can see, they are numeric and they are unique, which are the 2 things that one thing that Vue requires is uniqueness. I don't have to make these numbers. I can make them another string if I wanted to. Like I can say test. And Vue would be okay with that, as long as the value of ID was unique across each element to this array. Does that make sense? It has to be unique to this element. If it's not, then Vue gets very mad, confused, and might actually error out by accident. Just gonna undo that really quick. And so if you look at this code here, so I'm gonna launch my code. You guys can see that we have a regular element, it's a regular old bullet point list here with the 3 elements that we saw earlier. And to see what we mean by dynamically resizable, I'm going to use some formatting that you guys haven't maybe seen yet, but is definitely will be important for your checkpoint coming up. So I'm going to use something called I'm going to use a function that you haven't talked about earlier, but you'll catch on pretty quick. So I think it was app.list was the name. Append. So append kind of adds something to an array, as the name kind of suggests. So we're going to give this an ID of 3 and a text value. I think it was text, right? Let me double check. Yeah, text of I just added this. Now, if you run our code, watch what happens. Oh, never mind. Oh, wait, it's not append. It's push. My bad. Now, look. I just added this item to the array, meaning it automatically changed the v4, right, the number of LIs to match the number of items in that array. And so that's why you can use, that's where, again, where Vue becomes powerful, is it synchronizes these changes between the JavaScript we type and the HTML the user sees like that, almost instantly. I can't snap, but like that, almost instantly. And so we can add or even remove, if you want to do that now, as quickly or as easily as you guys want. Are there any questions about this demo program in particular? No, okay, that's good. With that in mind, it is time to jump into a demo program one, or not demo, checkpoint number 1. So I got some good feedback that people felt that the checkpoints weren't really that weren't that oriented, and they kind of felt they didn't know what they're doing for checkpoints, which I kind of understand. And so I try to make these checkpoints for this lesson a little bit more focused, that had some actual tasks to complete for everyone. So checkpoint number 1 is a little bit of a longer one, so we're going to spend a little bit of more time in breakout rooms. But it is to make a page that has a text box and a button. When the button is clicked, the text from the text box is added as a list item to the page. And I have here in parentheses, this is exactly what your final project will probably end up having to do. So it's a really good practice for your final project. And then some hints here, you will have to use at least a vbind, a vmodel, a v4, and a von. So basically using almost every V directive we've learned so far. And then the bottom one's a little bit, if you have, should be not append, it should be pop, my bad. But you may also want to use the .pop, not append, that's my bad, or push, not pop, oh my goodness, .push function to add an element to a JavaScript array. So if you kind of recall the syntax I used earlier, it'll be very similar to that. Now, however, it is time to move on to part 3, which is all about Vue Components. So Vue Components are usually really useful because we can create and add quote unquote custom HTML elements And these components can have their own data, their own methods, computed properties, etc. The one catch, however, is that each component must be registered before it can be used. And so we'll walk through how you can actually register these components. But I do want to highlight the fact that when I say custom HTML elements, I really do mean custom HTML elements. What's really going to happen is that when you type out your components, you will, in your HTML code, just as a regular tag, type your component name like you would any other HTML tag. And Vue will automatically replace it with the values stored between, that we define later in this process here. So first thing is registration, like I said. So to register a component, we have to do this before we call it. We must call this function Vue.components before we create a new Vue instance. So Vue.component must be before we do like the let or const app equals new Vue we've talked about in previous lessons. If you do it afterwards, it is not guaranteed that Vue will properly change the elements out. So this component function you can see is a function, as like there's little parentheses here to tell us a function, takes multiple parameters that we must define for our Vue instance. And we'll go through these one by one. So first, as a reference to all of you, here's like a fully featured Vue component definition. We will go through this stuff line by line, and you will probably not use most of this. But in like a completely, like if you want to go like straight up use everything available to you, here's all most of the important fields you can use. But we're not going to go over most of these. Or we're going to go over them. We won't use most of these. So the first one here, so I'm going to have the kind of this on the side here, the actual component definition from the slide before, and I will highlight the important part in each slide. So this first part is component name. Oops, sorry about that. So component name, is you guys can see, is going to be a string that represents how the component is represented in HTML. So when you actually want to use your component, you'll reference it by its component name. The convention, by convention, really do mean convention. It's more of like a standard. You have to use what's called kebab case. So it's lowercase, and each word has to be separated by a hyphen. What that means is that when you have a component name, for example, if it's that your component name is Purdue Pete, you would say lowercase Purdue hyphen, then the word Pete, again, all lowercase. This is because a lot of HTML, well, most modern browsers like Firefox and Chrome and Edge will probably be okay, but some other older mobile browsers will crash and stop working if they encounter spaces, underscores, or capitalization. If you run your code with that kind of capitalization or something inside of Chrome or Firefox or Safari, like a modern, very popular web browser, it'll probably work, but not guaranteed because the standard only allows for lowercase and hyphens. Next important field here is a props field. So props is like an array of parameters that are passed to the component, kind of like HTML property. To define props, you would put the name of the prop as a string as an element in this array. So for example, we'll have an example of this later, but for example, you can say like if your prop is param1 and param2, you would say in quotes param1, comma, in quotes param2. And then you can use like a faux HTML property to pass a value for that param. And when I say HTML property, that means when you use the element inside of your HTML code, you will write param1 equals sign, then the value, and then param2 equals sign and the value, just like you would properties like src or href or title or something like that. Props are completely optional, so only include this line if you need them. If you don't need them, like you have an empty array here, like I have in this example, do not include any kind of props. So kind of like strike out the line here. Next is template. Template is required. It's one of the few required components for a component. It is going to be a string that describes the HTML tags of the element. So literally, what will happen is when you do your type a component out in your HTML file, Vue will just literally replace that component name with whatever you type in the template. So it's kind of like a Control-C, Control-V kind of thing. It acts like a mini HTML page in that you can use tags, child tags, class and ID names, V directives, you name it. Like I said, it is pure HTML that can be copy pasted into the actual page. You can even use other Vue components, I think. And this is required because the component needs to know what to render when Vue sees that component name in your HTML. Next is data. So here's a bit tricky. We're going to spend some more time on this one. So data as kind of like the data fields we talked about in the main Vue instance from last week, and we used this week in our checkpoints. But here's the one catch. In components and components only, data must be a function that returns an object with the initial values of all the data fields. What does that really actually mean? What that means is that when you have your data function, in components, it has to be a function, you will return an object that has the same kind of layout as a data object in the base Vue instance. So key, colon, value, comma, key, colon, value, whatever we've seen before. Why do we need this way? Well, this is because Vue actually, with the backend, inside its own internal code, all components that have the name component name use the same data field or kind of reference the same data object in your component definition here. So if you don't have a function that returns a new set of initial values, then what would happen is that Vue or the data would be synced across every component, meaning a change to the value of one data field and one component would be made to every single data value in every other component with the same name. And that's not good because we want our components to be unique and have their own kind of internal data values. What a function allows us to do is set up initial values that the program can maintain of its own values internally, and they won't be modified across anywhere else. Actually, to counteract any bugs that might occur, if you define data normally like you would in the regular Vue instance in the component definition, Vue will actually throw you an error and just refuse to work because it knows that a very common source of bugs is going to be forgetting that component data fields need to be functions. And we'll have examples showing this. Next one is methods. This is exactly like the methods in the old kind of initial Vue instance. Again, totally optional. This is really useful for event handlers. If you don't have any event, on clicks or v-ons, don't bother including them. Not super important. And finally, computed. Again, computed acts just like it did last week in the basic Vue instance. If you don't need them, don't include it. So you can just strike out the line, don't actually include anything here. Are there any questions about how to register or use a Vue component? Fine. It is time to jump into demo number 2. So we're going to close this out really quick and open up our JS file as well. So here is our HTML file. So we have some Vue components here. Some text kind of showing it off. If you look, we have 3 components: this basic component, this prop component, and this data component. And if you look, again, kebab case, lowercase, and each word is separated by a hyphen. And it looks like a regular HTML. So it's the regular tag structure. We've got the open brackets, like the closing slash here to represent the ending. Again, Vue will change it for us. And then look here, we even have vbind. So we can assume that text and another prop are probably props that we use. And look here in the bottom, data component is 2, meaning there are 2 instances of data component. And we'll see why that matters in a second. So let's go to our demo file. I have definitions for all the components. We'll go through them one by one. I also, in the demos, include little tips that you guys might want to think about or even look at or even know about when coding your own examples. So the first tip here is about the template string. And that is when you want to have a multi-line string, you can use a backtick. So I kind of copied it over there too if you don't have it on your keyboard. But a backtick is the key above the tab and to the left of the one on most keyboards. It's called a grave. Also, it's I think I think it's a grave. I could be wrong about that in some words as well. I call it a backtick, whatever you want to call it. And reason we use it is it creates a multi-line string. By default in JavaScript, the template string only allows like a one-liner. So if you have like a complicated element, you could end up having multiple long, 500 character lines that are hard to read and hard to properly check if they work or not. But a backtick, like you see here, allows you to have a template on a separate, each tag on a separate line. So it looks like regular HTML more, meaning it's easier for you, the programmer, to make sure your component works. So here you can set the basic component. It has only the things that are required for a component to function. So we call Vue.component. Our name is basic-component. And we have the same format we talked about in the slides, and the template string, which is going to be a div, and then some h3 and a p tag. Really simple, really basic. You probably won't use too many of these, but you never know. Next, before I go into there, so you guys can see it right there, basic component used just like you would any other component, HTML tag. Next is prop component. So a tip here for you is props should be all lowercase because some browsers do not support uppercase or underscore HTML. So again, here's prop component, our name of our components, and then inside of the what do you call it, the options, the props, and we have two props, text and another prop. And so again, you see here that they are going to be strings. So it's going to be an array of string, like I mentioned, text, comma, another prop. And what Vue does is it kind of sees, do these properties exist? And if they do, their value is passed to the template string. Once you define your props, you can use them in your template string like you would any normal, any kind of normal, Vue variable. So I have a div here. Again, the backticks to have a multi-line string. And you can see I have this text, and then I have this another prop. And these will be replaced like they would any other Vue variable with the value of text and the value of another prop. So they're kind of being passed, and we're modifying the result of the results of the rendering based on the value of some props. And you can see the way you define props like you would any other thing is right here. Again, they act like faux HTML properties. So we say the name of the prop, $, and the value. Or if you're going to use vbind, you vbind the property, $, and then you put the variable name with which you want to bind the value of the property to. Next is a data component. So the tip here is to replace the data with this right here and see what happens. And it'll break. What'll actually happen is it'll break. So we have one prop with some text. And then look here, we have a data function. So data, it is a function. And you can see the function returns. The function should only do one thing, it's immediately return. It should have basically no logic in it unless you absolutely have some valid use case. Logic should be handled elsewhere in your program. So as you can see, data returns one thing, which is click, and it's an object with only one key value pair, click : 0. And what that does, like I mentioned, is it defines the initial values of your data, meaning every instance of the data component will have its own object with its own value of click : 0. And they can change them at will, and the changes will not be made anywhere else in the code. I also have a method here because I have a button that has a beyond click that handles the click. And what this does is it'll increment the value of click meaning it'll show you essentially on the button how many times the button has been clicked. So look at our concept or Vue instance. It's pretty simple. We just got, fox, the value fox, there's a string, dog, and button, which again, a string. And this will just be passed in as props. And we can see the prop being passed in and data component right there. Again, the full property text and button. So if you run this code, and you can see that we have some example of Vue components. The first one, like I said, basic component, nothing fancy. Second component, if you saw, it replaced this entire thing. The quick brown fox was before this a prop. I think it's called, prop or text, something like that. It replaced the value of that with quick brown fox because that is the value that we passed into it through Vue. Same thing with the lazy dog part here. You guys see at the end. Again, that was a prop that we've changed with the value of a V, with the value of using the power of Vue. Next is the data component. So look. This prop has data, and what happens is we click it, watch the button. You'll say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. But the change here, if you want to be very careful, is that look at the bottom button. It's also the exact same data component, but the prop was not, since the data were functions, this click is still set to 0. Meaning we can click this button and it won't change the value of this click and vice versa. Meaning we click them as many times as we want, and their data will be always remain unique. Now, what happens if you do that replacement there? So if we replace data with the standard way we would define data, we talked about last week. Oh, sorry about that. Like that, and we try to rerun our code, it doesn't work. And if we can see, open up our console, and we go to our console, you can see Vue gives a nice big warning. Data option should be a function that returns a per instance value. And they'll say it's not rendered properly. And again, that's because Vue knows, excuse me, that a lot of bugs occur if you don't define things as a function. So we just replace that. There we go. Now we replace with the function definition. We render it and it works. And the console has no more errors. So are there any questions about this demo program? Cool. We now have, I think, 2 or 3 more slides to cover before we head into checkpoint number 2. Yeah. The first one is component slots. So this is a little bit of a trickier topic to kind of think about, but a component slot is a kind of a custom tag, the slot tag you guys see in the bottom here, that you can define inside of and only inside of a Vue component. And that allows other HTML to be placed like a child tag inside of the slots. So the component can essentially act as a wrapper around the data. Why do we want this? Well, again, it can be a wrapper, like I mentioned, and there are some use cases. So for example, if you had a to-do list, I'm going to say to-do list because that's a very common use case for this, as well as being a final project. You can maybe have your add to-do button functionality as a wrapper, and a slot will actually store the data of your to-dos. And that's how we use slots. And we'll see an example of that in a second. Next one here is custom events. So you can have a component raise a custom event. If you remember, the only events we've seen so far is a click, right? The V on and click, and maybe if you got a little bit fancy, a key down or key up. But we can also use we can also raise any kind of events that we want. In your function, if you use this code, this $ emits and then the name, that will actually raise the name event with some optional data that can be passed to the event handler. You do not need to include the dot part if you don't have it. It's just there if you need it. You'll see an example of that maybe in a little bit. And to handle this, you just use a v on colon like you would normal, just replacing the name of the event, which is normally click for us, with the name here. So a common use case for this is in a component where you have multiple buttons and you want to have some logic handled by the main Vue instance. The main Vue instance won't know what button is clicked because button clicks are handled on a per component basis. So the component will handle the button clicking inside. But if you want the logic to occur in the main Vue instance, it has to know which button was clicked, right? And so we can use inside the event handle in the component, just raise an event. And we can have a different event for every button. Meaning when we, in the main instance, know exactly which button was clicked because each one raises a different custom event. I know I personally used plenty of these kind of emits and custom events in my sample to do project, which you guys will probably have to work on in a few weeks. All right, that's demo program number 3, really quick. Let's close out this and launch demo number 3. So let's look at HTML first. So first things first, we have this demo component here. So look at this really carefully. Excuse me. I have a demo component, and then look at this. Normally in demo number 2, the demo component just ended there, right? So it's like open tag and then a close tag. But because of a slot, which will show in the actual JS file, we can put a child tag, or even more if we wanted to, inside of this component. So we have this child component nested inside of the demo component tags. Demo component also has a parameter, we call it click, bound to the variable click count because of the vbind here. And child component has a event handler called vOnPress, meaning this component will raise the press event sometimes, or maybe never, but sometimes, that has to be handled by our main Vue instance. And that name of that function is handle press. So look at our code. Here's a code for a demo component. As you can see, we have one property dot click and our template string. So template, we got some, this demo component here, and watch the order of the p tags. So this first one says this text comes before, then the slot. So again, slot is where the child component will be slotted into or kind of placed inside of. And then the second p text in this text comes afterwards. And then finally the inner button was clicked X number of times, where X is a variable click. Next is this child component. So we have no prompt and only the template string here, which is this text comes in the middle. So see what happens. When the text will be rendered, you will see it say before, middle, and then afterwards, because the HTML here will literally be copy pasted into the slot command here. Finally, we have a button, vOnClick, which when you click it, will run the event send event. And when the event handler send event is a function that does one thing, and that is emit. So again, raise a custom event called press. And because this has no kind of associated other data we want to travel with the event handler, we just had nothing there. If you wanted to pass other data, you would do comma and the data there. But since we don't, there's no reason to have it, so we have it blank. Finally, on const app, Elijah has a question, which is the child component inserted just based on the position of the slot tag? Yeah, exactly, you got it. So literally any HTML that is literally between the tags, right? So for example, a double component is literally just copy pasted into the slot. So wherever the slot is going to be the HTML that will be slotted in, like I mentioned, from the main element. So that's why we have the ordering. That's why you be very careful where you put it. Because like I said here, it's going to go, this p tags come first, and then this p tag and the button, and then these two p tags. So if you want the order to be different, you would have to move around the slot to adjust that new order you wanted. Finally, we have a regular old Vue instance, one data property, click count, and this function here. So whenever the child component raises the emit event, all this will do is add one or kind of increment the click count by one. And why do we want this? Well, if you see, this is kind of like we had in our demo program from demo number 2, the last component we made. This one, while the button that we're using to increment the count is in child component, we're displaying the count in demo components. So we can use this kind of combination of slots and events to kind of like move data between different components. And when we render this into screen, Firefox, we have this, so you can see before, middle, after. And then as we click the send event button, it will increment the counter here. So 0, 1, 2, blah, 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 as many times as we want. Are there any questions about this demo program? Cool. With that, it is time to jump. Oh, sorry. Can you explain a bit again? Totally. So yeah, it's a bit weird, but emit, all it does is kind of like emit or raise, the proper terminology, a custom event. So if you guys remember the V on, right, click, that was to handle the click event. By default, JavaScript only defines a few kind of events, click, and then key presses, also keyboard presses. But oftentimes we want to raise other events to kind of like do things that more complicated actions that don't necessarily involve a button. And so we can use custom events, emit in this case, to raise and tell Vue, okay, handle this event. So if you think about it, what will happen is what will happen here is on this V on press, think of press like click. It's just an event. It really has nothing to do but essentially tell Vue that something that the user has done has occurred and you want to maybe change the page depending on what event happened. Before, we only did key, like again, button presses, but now we can kind of raise any kind of event in response to other things. The very common use case, like I mentioned, is if you have, in this component, we had multiple buttons. Say we had 3 buttons, but we wanted each button to do something different. Because events are handled by their components, that means that if I click, say, if I copy this button, as an example, I copy this button here, and I change this. When I click the second button, what happens is it looks to see, does the V-on handler exist for click inside of this template? If it doesn't, the click is ignored by everyone. If I want to handle the click, say, inside of the actual, in the main Vue instance, I want this Vue instance to handle it and not this component, I have to tell Vue which button was clicked. And to do that, the easiest way is to define a function. So we'll say second one here, actually. We'll say send other function. And we'll change this to send other. And we can say, okay, so when this button is clicked, I want you to tell the main Vue that this button was clicked. So we can say we can emit, meaning raise a new event. We'll call this one other. Just pack of it. And so we can handle that event just like we would any other event. So we can put another V on here, V on other, and we'll run handle other. And then in our main Vue, again, to write an event handler, you need the V on. And then in the method section of your Vue instance, you had to type the same function. So handle other function. I want to do a console.log. We'll say pressed other. Now, if we run our code here, cool. and we open up our browser console, and I drag it here so everyone can see it properly. I'll shrink it down a little bit. Okay, now if you click this button here, we increment the button like we did normally. And if we click this button, we in the console printed other. So actually dock you to that so we can see you easily. We click it, it'll keep sending out. You can tell because this number keeps increasing. It'll keep sending out the pressed other benefit. And this button only increments the count. What is the benefit of doing emit over a regular function? Yeah, so it's a bit tricky to kind of think about, but a great example of this that I had in my demo program that I'll talk about is maybe you're trying to modify a database. And the best way to modify a database is to always kind of do it in one place to avoid like overwriting some old data. And so maybe you only want this view, a function defined here to only there to modify the database, because otherwise you could have like issue with, like corruption. All right, so what you can do is whenever I click a button, then I want the user to modify, to save some data to the database. While you could have it just be saved in like a function here, right, in this methods area right here, like I said, what could happen is there could be some kind of corruption going on, which is very common with databases. And so you can emit an event saying, okay, I've pressed this button. The user would like to save this data and let the main view instance handle the database saving. Another example is like we had here, there's a data value inside of the main view instance you want to modify with a button click. But since this component cannot modify this data, right? This component doesn't even know this exists. It's completely separate. If we wanted to modify some data in here, we did the click count, we would have to raise an event and let the main view instance modify it for us. By letting it know we want to be modified by raising an event or emitting an event. Does that kind of answer your question? It's a bit of a trickier thing to explain, and you'll get the hang of it pretty quickly when you start coding, but it's a little bit weird to kind of talk about abstract like this. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Okay, so that was kind of, I would say the end, but it is kind of like a good intro to everything you will ever have to know to make most Vue applications. And so using a combination of, emits, slots, components, and Vue directives, you can make literally anything you want now. It's just a matter of thinking the logic through. With that in mind, we're going to come back to this checkpoint slide. I want to thank everyone for coming. And of course, our feedback form is there. I really do love this feedback. You guys have been giving us some great advice that we have been making some changes. I hope to kind of fit your feedback. And as a reminder to everyone, we have review hours on Thursdays, 6 to 7 p.m. I recommend you guys start coming to them because the final project can get a little tricky to think about, and having some extra help, an extra set of eyes look it over is a great experience. With that in mind, it is time for checkpoint number 2. So checkpoint 2 is going to be modifying checkpoint 1. So if you didn't finish it, no problems, go back and work on that now. Is to modify checkpoint 1 to use Vue Components, Vue Slots, and Vue Custom Events. What I kind of envision here is that you would have your add button, like see the text box in the button to add an event to the list, right, as a separate component with a slot where you can add these LIs in as a slot, like I said, because the slot will just be replaced with the code that's nested within the major element. And why do we care about this? Well, because this serves as a basis for your final project. You will definitely need to use this kind of format of like a wrapper, slots, and events to do all of the things we'll talk about next week in the final project day more, but to do all of that. And therefore, it's a good practice to do it now. With that in mind, thank you everyone though for coming, and let's jump into breakout room for this final checkpoint.